I've talked, and I'm not going to repeat, I've talked a lot about the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and its two cousins, National Public Radio and PBS. The United States taxpayers spend $500 million a year subsidizing these media organizations. I've talked about that. There was a time when maybe we needed to do that, back in the 40s and the 50s, when we only had 3 TV stations and a handful of radio stations. It might have been necessary for the government to get in the TV and radio business, particularly to help our citizens in rural areas, but those days are gone. Now there are all kinds of forms of media. We've got TV, newspapers, radios, we've got the internet, we've got Facebook, we've got blogs, we've got podcasts, we've got cable TV, we've got streaming TV. But yet, the government continues to spend $500 million a year.
Today we're diving into a fiery Senate speech from none other than Senator John Kennedy, who just called out NPR, PBS, and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and let's just say, he did not hold back. $500 million a year in taxpayer money? For media that he claims is biased and outdated? Let's get into it. So here's the deal: every year, around $500 million goes from federal taxpayers straight into the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which funds NPR and PBS.
To subsidize the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, the National Public Radio, and PBS. And it ought to stop. It ought to stop. President Trump's talked about it. Many members of Congress have talked about it. I've talked about it on the floor of the Senate. Now, some of my colleagues say the reason it ought to stop is because the so-called journalism being published by NPR and PBS, which get their money from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which gets its money from you, out of your pocket, $500 million a year. Some of my colleagues say, well, we ought to stop it because the reporting is biased. And they've marshaled a persuasive argument to that effect. I mean, I've talked about some of the articles that have appeared paid for with the American people's tax dollars. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I'll just mention a couple. Here's one: How Racism Became a Marketing Tool for Country Music. That's pretty fair and balanced, huh? Here's another one: The Hidden Racism of Young White Americans. AP fact check: Trump seeds race animus with COVID falsehood. Here's another one: Biden trumpets economic gains but struggles to get credit. Here's another one: Democracy on Trial, Part 1, a blueprint for the case against Trump. It's paid for with your tax dollars. This is opinion journalism. But it's not just at the national level. It's in my state, too. It's in Louisiana. Louisiana has 318 radio stations. Only 10 of them get money from federal taxpayers through the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. So the folks
which funds NPR and PBS. Senator Kennedy argues that this made sense back in the 1940s and 50s, when options were limited. But today, we've got streaming, podcasts, YouTube, cable, social media, you name it. He says there's simply no need for the government to be bankrolling media in the age of digital overload. Is it time to rethink this expense? Kennedy didn't just go after the budget. He came armed with headlines, actual article titles funded with your tax dollars. Let me read a few. How Racism Became a Marketing Tool for Country Music.
The folks who are publishing the articles I just referenced are picked 10 out of 138 in Louisiana and said, we're going to favor you and give you money. My state also has 48 TV stations. 8 of them get federal money, your dollars. I don't know what the other ones did, not to get federal money, but clearly this is a case of the federal government picking and choosing. Let's see what they've done with the money. Let's take this down. Put up the local ones, John. I'll just read you a couple of the headlines paid for with your dollars in my local public media organizations. How illegitimate critical race theory concerns shaped Louisiana's new social studies standards. No bias there. Trump's anti-trans effort is an agenda cornerstone with echoes in history. No bias there. That came from NPR and one of my local stations. Here's another. What it's like to choose transgender sex reassignment surgery. Another. Transgender boy tells mom it shouldn't be scary to be who we are. Here's another one. This came from WRKF, which also gets, it's one of the 10 out of 138 radio stations that the bureaucrats at CPB look with favor on. Kids will end their lives. Anti-trans legislation is impacting mental health in the Gulf South. No bias there. Biography examines how systemic racism shaped the troubled life of George Floyd. Nobody has to take responsibility. It's systemic racism. Here's another that came from WRKF. Christian nationalism support is strongest in rural conservative states. Another, Dr. Rachel Levine, focused on her job at HHS. Still, anti-trans politics followed her. Here's another one by WRKF.
Trump embodies nearly every aspect of a racist. Arguments that trans athletes have an unfair advantage lack evidence, so yeah. He calls that opinion journalism, not unbiased reporting, and insists it's pushing a one-sided agenda under the guise of public service. Do you think these headlines cross the line into activism, or are they just telling hard truths? Drop a comment below, I really want to know your take. Kennedy brought receipts from his home state of Louisiana, where just a handful of local stations get CPB funding. He argues it's government picking winners and losers, favoring certain outlets while others get nothing. That's a huge deal.
Another example of opinion journalism paid for with your taxpayer dollars. These far-right media figures are getting center stage under Trump. Let me see another one, John. But there's more, as they say on The Price is Right, or something like that. Here's another one. This came from Louisiana Public Broadcasting. Becoming Papa, father's key to gender justice. I can tell you that every mom and dad in Louisiana, when they lie down to sleep at night, and they can't, they're lying there worried about gender justice. Not. I mean, the article, the title of the article suggests what you ought to believe. That's not fair or balanced. Here's another one. Transgender athletes seek protections to play sports. Let me see the next one, John. Put that one up for me. This is John Lowry, who works with me. He's a fine American. I love this one. This is from one of my local radio stations in Louisiana. Arguments that trans athletes have an unfair advantage lack evidence to support. What planet did this reporter parachute in from? He or she really believes that men don't have a physical advantage over a woman in sports? Here's another headline. Trump embodies nearly every aspect of a racist, author says. Another, The Nation, confronting Trump's coded racism. This is coming from my local TV and radio stations that get money from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Here's another one. Sexism is out in the open in the 2016 campaign. That may have been inevitable. I wonder who the author of this piece voted for. Here's another one. Is Trump really that racist? I wonder who that reporter voted for. Here's the final one I'm going to mention. I don't want to put too fine a point on this, but scientists start to tease out the subtler ways racism hurts health. Now look, you don't have to be a Latin scholar to see that these articles are biased.
In his words, what happened to treating everyone equally? If the feds are going to fund media, should it be media or none at all? With the U.S. sitting on $36 trillion in debt, Kennedy says it's irresponsible to fund any media organization, especially ones that half the country feels alienated by. And look, whether you're left, right, or somewhere in between, you've got to admit, $500 million isn't pocket change. Is public broadcasting a luxury we can't afford? If you're enjoying this kind of deep dive content, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We break down stories like this every single week, and trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next.
They're biased.
Kennedy.
Every single one of them. At the federal level and at the state and local level in Louisiana. And you know what? That's the right of these state and local television stations. They have the right to say this stuff. But they don't have the right to say it with your money. They don't have the right to say it with your money. Some of my colleagues are angry at the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, at NPR and PBS, because of their obviously biased reporting. Now, that's just a fact. No fair-minded American can look at these headlines and say those aren't biased. And some of my colleagues are mad about that. That's not what concerns me the most. I'm sorry they're mad, but that's not what concerns me the most. My question is this: what in God's name, what on God's green earth are we doing with a $36 trillion deficit and $36 trillion worth of debt, which is just accumulated deficits? Why are we giving certain TV stations and certain radio stations in America, but not others, $500 million a year? Why? They don't need it. And even if they did need it, they shouldn't get the money to the exclusion of every other media organization. What happened to treating all people and all entities similarly situated similarly? And so that's why I support abolishing the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. I want to say it again. The people who wrote these articles and the people who published these articles have every right to do that. I mean, I'm a firm believer in the First Amendment. Without the First Amendment, how are we supposed to know who the idiots are? I support the First Amendment. And these folks have the right to publish that. But they do not have the right to publish it with taxpayer money. $500 million a year. And we know how, I think you know how I feel. We know how President Trump feels, but I hope the United States Congress, in our reconciliation package, abolishes the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and no longer gives them or any media organization in this country a single solitary dime of taxpayer money. That's not the role of the federal government. and given these kind of articles to do so, incites the anger of at least half of our country.
Coming
And that's
next,
not right.
Kennedy says, shut it all down, no more funding, no more favoritism, let NPR and PBS stand on their own, like every other media outlet. Others argue these services still provide vital education and cultural programming, especially in underserved communities. What do you think? Should the government stop funding NPR and PBS altogether? Or is this an attack on journalism disguised as fiscal responsibility? Let's get that conversation going below. And as always, stay curious, stay informed, and I'll see you in the next one.